Hey, y'all. Welcome to Children of Darkness and Light's True Crime Wednesday. I'm Lori Hellis, and I'm your host. And boy, do we have a lot to talk about today. As you probably know, the Murdoch case has been going on for a week and a half. And so they've selected a jury and they're taking testimony. There's a lot to talk about in that case. There's a verdict in the Mark Jensen case out of Kenosha. That was a retrial of a murder case that happened in 1988, where he was accused of poisoning his wife with antifreeze. So we've got those things to talk about, a couple things to talk about in the University of Idaho Brian Kohberger case, and a lot of just other things to catch up on. So while we kind of wait for everybody to join us, we've got 58 in chat so far. So while we've got a few while we're waiting for a few more to join us, I'll just talk about a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I have requests for bracelets, and I'm going to be working on those this week and over the weekend. So you should be getting them soon. So if you've sent me an envelope, it's undoubtedly in this stack, and I will get them off to you. A couple of other things. The latest video for our quilt-along program is up. And I have some sample squares to show off, a little show and tell. Here's our pinwheel square. This is the center block for the quilt. And then this is one of our other squares. So next week, we're going to be learning all about how to make Dresden plate. And we're going to do a square within a square quilt. So if you haven't started yet, there's plenty of time to catch up. And the link to the pattern and all the other information is in our show notes today. Also had a lot of folks asking about the address for Judge Boyce for people who wanted to send letters in the Vallow-Daybell case. To encourage the court to allow cameras during the trial. And that is in the show notes as well. So I think that kind of wraps up our housekeeping. Welcome to everybody who's joining us. Most of what we're going to talk about today is Murdoch, but I do have a couple things I want to address in the Kohberger case as well. So let me get to my notes. I don't know whether the Kohberger case is attracting more social media and more sort of conspiracy theories than usual, or whether this is just something that I haven't seen before because I haven't been in a lot of the social media groups. But this case has drawn so much attention, and I just want to be very clear. First of all, I worked as a public defender for many years in a small community, and I know what it takes to be a public defender and some of the things that happen when you are a state public defender and you come up against what could potentially be a conflict. And what I can tell you is that the state decides case assignments. The state decides ultimately what cases will be assigned to what lawyers. So in general, what happens is the public defense office, it varies a little bit in the way it's organized between states. But essentially what happens is the state public defender sends a lawyer down to court on arraignment day to pick up cases. And that lawyer then takes the cases back to the administrator, and the administrator decides case assignments. Now, in high visibility cases or in highly complex cases, you can see the state administrator getting in touch with a qualified lawyer and saying, you're going to be assigned to this case. So that's what happened for Ann Taylor. She is the only attorney in her judicial district, which includes several counties, that is qualified, is on the state qualified list for capital cases, and is qualified to be lead counsel in a capital case. So what happens is the state is going to appoint somebody in the jurisdiction first, because if they appoint somebody from out of county, it's going to be immensely more expensive. They're going to have to pay somebody to come into town, pay them, pay for their hotels, pay for their food, pay for their transportation. It's just a way more expensive proposition. So the state got in touch with Ann Taylor, who is eminently qualified, and said, we would like you to represent Brian Kohberger in this case. And then either she or somebody at the state office then took a look and said, we need to make sure that you're free to take this case. So we need you to clear the decks, basically. So I'm sure that she was trying to wrap up her current cases or trying to transfer them out. One of the people who she was appointed to represent and had represented before was a woman called Kara Kernodle. She goes by a different last name now, but she's still in the court database as Kernodle. She is the mother of victim Xana Kernodle. And a lot of people have jumped to the conclusion that this is a conflict. Now, if you take my newsletter, you know that I wrote a whole newsletter about why it's not a conflict, did the homework, listed out all the rules and the statutes, and gave you all of that information. I also shared that with anybody who would listen, and many of the other LawTube lawyers agreed it's not a conflict, because Kara Kernodle and Brian Kohberger are not in any kind of opposing cases, or they're not directly opposed or adverse to one another. Now, does it look great? Probably not. And I've said from the beginning, the optics aren't probably great, but that's what happens in a small jurisdiction. So we've just seen this continued drumbeat from a particular news network, Ashley Banfield. We've seen this drumbeat over and over and over from with her and a woman who's an FBI agent. Her name is Jennifer Coffendaffer, who she's a retired FBI agent, beating this drum of this is a conflict. Ann Taylor needs to get off the case. And it's absolutely not true. Ashley Banfield did a two-part interview with Kara Kernodle. She is a desperate drug addict who desperately needs treatment and needs our support and our patience and our understanding. And she was as much victimized by the media as she has been by Brian Kohberger. Using her as clickbait was just unforgivable, in my opinion. So lots of people, there's been a lot flurries of information and stuff going back and forth, particularly on Twitter. So just be aware. The bulk of people who I have talked to, the homework I have done says Ann Taylor does not have a conflict. And it is critically important at this point that Kara Kernodle gets some help and some treatment for her mental health and her drug addictions. She has drug convictions and drug issues that go back into the mid-90s. So 25 years she's been battling with addiction issues. And to me, that means that it's all the more impressive that Xana was in college and doing well and maintaining a good, healthy relationship with her boyfriend, Ethan. All those things are really impressive. And I'm proud of the progress that Xana was making. But I think that we should all give the victims and their families the benefit of the doubt, and we should absolutely not be using them to build our platforms. I think that's really beyond unforgivable. So now I'm off my soapbox. Enough said. Anna Walsh case. There haven't been a lot of developments in Anna's case. It's a no body case at this point. And what we know is that the husband who has been arrested and is in jail for her murder, the YouTube search or the Google search alone is probably enough to convict him, doing searches about how to get rid of bodies and how long it is before they start to smell, and a number of how to dismember a body and all kinds of other just nauseatingly awful searches on Google. So, it's going to be difficult, but they were able to find evidence in his basement, and also evidence that he had thrown away in a trash that had not yet been incinerated. But unfortunately, there's video of him going around to dumpsters in the area where his mother's home was, shortly after it's assumed that she died. And before the police were able to get to them, those dumpsters, the contents went into the incinerators. So it's unlikely that they're ever going to recover anything more, and certainly not her body. And no body cases are more difficult to try. Not impossible. I think we've talked before about a case that I knew of when I was in Oregon, where they were able to convict without a body. But it is more difficult. Now to the big news. First of all, for those of you who asked me to watch the Marcus Jensen case, I have some things to think about, to say about that case. He was found guilty today. This was a retrial of his earlier conviction for murdering his wife by poisoning her with antifreeze. So he was convicted, and sentencing has been set out. So we don't know what the ultimate sentence will be. So let's talk about Murdoch. For those of you who may not know about the Murdoch case, and this is in our show notes this time, so please, Law and Crime Network is covering it gavel to gavel and doing a really good job. I know there are other YouTube platforms that are also streaming it. My friend Gigi, who from Pretty Lies and Alibis, is there in the courtroom and is doing Q&As at the breaks, and then is doing her own Pretty Lies and Alibis YouTube program in her not very much spare time. So we put the links in the show notes. Do go there if you're interested. Gigi in particular did a series on the case to get everybody up to speed, because it is a very complicated and convoluted case. The other podcast and YouTube show to watch is the Murdoch Murders podcast, and that is done by Mandy Matney and Liz Farrell. and they've been doing a bang-up job. Mandy is a reporter from down in South Carolina, and she's been covering this case since it started. Quickly recap. Alec Murdoch is a fourth generation, very powerful. His great grandfather started the law firm where he was a partner. He and many of his family members all served as solicitor generals, which is like the local prosecutor. They were an incredibly powerful family, very wealthy, very powerful. They were notorious. They had two sons, Buster and Paul. Buster was a junior. And they were notorious for getting their kids out of trouble. And local law enforcement knew that there was no way they were ever going to get a Murdoch in trouble. That, you know, if they had a Murdoch kid in trouble, they just needed to take him home. And because Randolph, who was the patriarch, the grandfather, would be knocking on their door to resolve the problem. It was well known down there. You never want to steal from a Murdoch. You never want to be beholden or owe a Murdoch, because it means that you belong to them for the rest of your life. So Paul Murdoch, who was at that time 19, took his brother Buster's driver's license with Buster's permission and went out to party with his friends. His father let him take their speedboat, and off they went to a beach party down in the bay. I'm not that familiar with the area, but it's definitely an area that has lots of beach activity. So when they were done at that party, then Paul wanted to stop at another bar, and they did shots. And I mean, the ultimate outcome is he was extremely drunk. At the time, more than an hour, closer to 2 hours after the accident, at the hospital, he tested at 3 times the legal limit. So, and that was 2 hours after, when he'd had time to metabolize that alcohol. So he was driving the boat very recklessly. People were telling him to slow down. Every time they did, he'd go faster, until he hit a bridge abutment, you know, the pillars that stick down into the river, and crashed the boat. One of the women who was aboard the boat was ejected from the boat and died. So her family, her name was Mallory Beach, her family sued the Murdochs. And as a result of that suit, as the suit went along, the Murdoch, Alec Murdoch, was required to produce financial documents to show his net worth. And when that started to pressure in on him, it was discovered that he had been stealing millions from his personal injury clients over a period of years, and stealing from his partners. So it all started to close in on him. And at that point, someone murdered his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul, the Paul who had been in the boat accident. Everything points to it being Alec Murdoch. So he's currently on trial for the murder. He's also charged with 99 or 100 white-collar financial crimes. And so I'm pretty certain that he's not going to be getting out of jail anytime soon. But they've opted to try the murder case first. So last week we saw jury selection, and it was kind of interesting the way they did jury selection. What they did was they brought in 900 jurors, and they brought them in groups, and they As we will see in the Vallow case, they will ask them to do jury questionnaires, and then they will also subject them to questions. During that time, although the trial is being broadcast, during that time, the cameras were not on the jury. And there was a reason for that, security reason for that. Jurors, we don't want jurors identified, because when they're identified, then people in the community start putting pressure on them. They can get threats. They can get hounded by the media. I mean, there's so much going on in a trial, and you just don't want the jurors subjected to that. So even though they were asked some pretty pointed, straightforward questions that may have revealed their identities to anybody who knew people in the community, it was the judge's order that their faces not be shown on camera. And that's pretty typical. Yeah, in a small community, you might recognize their voice, or you might recognize their answers to questions and say, oh, I know that's Pete or that's Mavis. But courts try very hard to protect jurors, and it's as much a protection from the media, and from the media showing up at their houses, or the media showing up at their places of employment, or any of those things. So it's as much for that as for anything else. One of the really interesting things that has come up, kind of controversial, is they brought the police officers in, and the police were laying the foundation for their body-worn cameras as they did a variety of interviews and investigation. One of those body-worn cameras was trained on Alec Murdoch. I had somebody get on my case for all my ums and ahs, so I'm trying really hard not to and ah. It's hard. And I notice that the later it gets in the day, as I get into the evening, my uptake isn't quite as quick, and I and ah more. So please be patient with me. I'm working on it. One of the officers who was wearing body-worn camera was interviewing Alec Murdoch, and during that time, Alec Murdoch made a statement which has been interpreted two different ways. It's kind of like is the dress gold or is it gray? So interestingly enough, the body-worn footage, the police officer said, Alec said, he was there on the scene, and he said, it's so bad, I did him so bad. Now, other people say he said they did him so bad. Either way, he was talking about his son, Paul. And I'm not, because I don't want to get demonetized, going to talk at length about the details of the murder. But I am going to say it was horrendous. And the descriptions in the opening statements of the lawyers were awful and very disturbing. And I am certain that the people who are sitting on this jury are being subjected to incredibly disturbing images. So it is unclear at this point. Some people say he said they did him bad. They did him so bad. And some people say he gave that spontaneous confession, I did him so bad. So we'll have to see whether that comes up as they continue to present their case. So the most interesting thing that has been happening has been the information coming from all three cell phones, Paul's, Maggie's, and Alec Murdaugh's. Before I go there, though, I want to point out that the defense has been chipping away, poking holes, causing reasonable doubt. So interesting little things like Paul was killed with a shotgun, with birdshot. Maggie was killed with what they've been calling a 300 blackout. It is a sub-automatic, semi-automatic, sorry, I'm not a gun person, a semi-automatic like a heck, what do they call assault rifles, right? They're like an assault rifle, AR. And it's called the 300 blackout. And one of the points that was made was that Paul was shot with steel shot, which is generally used for waterfowl rather than lead shot. And that when they found this was a hunting property, a hunting lodge, and they routinely hunted on the property. There was a gun room with 25 guns and all kinds of ammunition and accessories and all those things, but they didn't find any steel shot, which I thought was interesting and definitely sort of pokes a little reasonable doubt at the case. The most interesting things, now I am going to actually transpose this, transcribe this testimony from the phones, because it's incredible and very complicated, but it creates a timeline which I'm very interested in. I am going to send that out in my newsletter, my next newsletter. So if you are not subscribed to my newsletter, you better get subscribed, because this is going to be additional information about the Murdoch case, lots of detail about the phone records. So, but the interesting thing is that they have been able to recover from cell phones everything from when they turned on, when they turned off, when they got their next text message, when they were turned from portrait to landscape view, how many steps people were walking, because they all had iPhones and they record steps in your health database. There was a lot more information than just a handful of text messages. So I thought that was really interesting. Creighton Waters, the prosecutor, in his opening statement said, Maggie and Paul's phones, within a matter of seconds of one another, locked and never unlocked again. There's some interesting discrepancies. There's a series of phone calls after. So this is the fascinating thing. We knew Maggie and Paul, were down at the dog kennels on this hunting property. They raised hunting dogs, and they were down there at the kennel. We knew that Paul had been having a text conversation with his best friend, Rogan, about his dog. Rogan had taken a job where he was working out of town during the week. And so his dog, his puppy, was living with the Murdochs in their kennel during the week when he was out of town working. And then he would come in on the weekends and pick the dog up. So they were hosting the dog while he was out of town. And Paul had gotten in touch with him and had some concern about the dog's tail, that it had either gotten injured or there was some sort of a problem with the dog's tail. And Rogan said, can you get me a picture? And so I can see what's going on, and maybe I'll send it to my vet. So we also knew that Maggie very routinely at the end of the day would go down to the dog kennel and let the dogs out to run, take care of them, and then put them in for the night. So not surprising that Maggie and Paul would both be down there. So we have this series of text messages of Paul texting with Rogan, trying to get a good picture of the dog's tail. And finally, he takes a video. He tries to FaceTime with Rogan. This all comes out in the testimony. He tries to FaceTime with Rogan, but the connection's not good out there. And so he says, well, I'll just take a video and I'll send it to you. So he takes this 11-second video of trying to get a picture of the dog's tail. In the background, you can hear both Maggie and Alec. Now, Alec previously told the police he was never down at the dog kennel before he found their bodies. So there's a big discrepancy there, because initially he said, I didn't go down to the dog kennel. I was up at the house. I took a nap. And then I went to visit my mom because my dad just went in the hospital. She gets nervous when he's not there, and she has Alzheimer's. And so he said he had never been down to the kennel. Well, it turns out he had been, because he can be heard on that 11-second video. And because it was created on Paul's phone, they know exactly when that video was created. And it was created just seconds, less than a minute after, before both his and Maggie's phones go silent forever. So really interesting. The other interesting thing is that that they're in Alec's call log. In Maggie's phone, the call log shows that there were incoming calls from him, that he made several incoming calls after he left to go visit his mother, which is likely, from all appearances, after Maggie and Paul were murdered. And he left to go visit his mother to create an alibi. And it's interesting because those calls show on Maggie's phone that they were incoming calls, but his call log has been wiped out. They did not investigate his phone and did not download his phone until the murders happened in early June, and they didn't get a hold of his phone until September, which is another sort of Murdoch rank has its privileges sort of thing. Was they were tiptoeing around him very, very carefully. So the trial has been absolutely fascinating. It's been really interesting. I haven't quite decided yet whether his lead attorney, Dick Harpootlian, who is a state senator, puts on that a little bit bumbling Columbo kind of persona, or whether he really is as uncomfortable with all the technology in the courtroom as it appears. They have this piece of machinery called an Elmo, which projects, it's like an overhead projector. It projects something printed on paper, except that it projects it onto computer screens. So the interface between that piece of equipment and getting it up on the screens has been a little bit challenging for everybody, but he's thoroughly befuddled by it all. So it's kind of interesting to see whether or not that's his style in court, or whether he really is as disorganized and as confused as he appears to be. It's very important when you are doing a complex case. The lawyers rehearse these things, particularly in these cases where there are hundreds of trial exhibits. So the prosecution has been doing a really good job of staying on their script. And officer, is this your report? And when did you create it? And how did you create it? And then going right to offering it into evidence and then questioning the police about it. And they're doing a really good job of staying on top of all that stuff. But in these kind of complex cases, you should have a lawyer whose only job is to make sure that all of that documentation is in order, all of it is being used in court the right way. And you really just had that person that's like a scrub nurse. They're just handing you the next document. They're handing you the next, but that can only happen if you have a very thorough outline of where you're going. You can't kind of make it up on the fly. You've got to know, okay, I'm going to ask this, and then you've got that person who's got the script and who's handing you all of the documents and handing you all of the exhibits as you go along. So I think the defense has someone doing that, but it's a little bit less clear about whose job it is to make sure that all those trial exhibits come together and all of those things flow. I think they're doing a pretty good job with a pretty complex case of laying it out. I do hope the jury's taking notes, because I found myself in a couple of instances having to back up and listen to something again. And the jury doesn't have that luxury. They've got to be on top of it, taking notes, because that's the only shot they get to hear that evidence. I did want to comment on Judge Newman, who is the judge in this case. He has been so on top of it, and yet patient and organized. He's very impressive. I know he's a very experienced judge, and I know that he's very well respected. I got a message from one of my followers saying that Judge Newman had been in their state, in their jurisdiction, and then had later gone to South Carolina. So he's very impressive. And I want to contrast that with the judge in the Jensen case. And I'm going to have to pull his name up, because I wrote it down and I managed to put it in a document. So the judge in the Jensen case, his name is Judge Milasakis. It's a wild name, Judge Milasakis. He is such a stark contrast. If you've been watching both cases, such a stark contrast to Judge Newman. Judge Newman is kind of methodical, quiet, kind of soft-spoken, kind of patient. And Judge Milasakis, on the other hand, is sharp, impatient, brusque, very kind of insulting and a little demeaning to the lawyers. And that makes it really difficult to try a case. And so I think the difference is when you have a judge who says, it's my job to call strikes and balls. It is not my job to figure out how these lawyers try their case, and is able to draw that line. I think that you get a better outcome, because the lawyers know the case. The lawyers know their theory of the case. They know where they're going. When you get a judge like Judge Milasakis, who seems to be trying to try the case, then I think you get somebody who's impatient and talking down to the lawyers, and it makes for a more difficult case for everyone. And I would argue that it's not as fair, because the judge is not in the position to try the case, to understand what's going on. The judge is in the position to manage the courtroom and call strikes and balls. So That was just interesting contrast as I was watching bits of both cases. I have not watched all of the Jensen case, but I will faithfully watch the Murdoch case because I know there are a lot of folks interested in it. If it tells you anything, I have pages of notes that look like this from the phone logs. So I am going to consolidate those into a document, and I'm going to share that document with you through my newsletter. So if you are not subscribed to the newsletter, I highly recommend that you do if you'd like to see that document. And the link is in the show notes. I think we're about ready to take some questions from folks who have probably also been watching the Murdoch case. I did see the question about the jury and not showing their faces. We kind of covered that one in early discussion, but we can talk about it again. Why in the Murdoch trial we're able to hear the potential jurors answer very pointed questions in a small community this clearly revealed identities. And love to my mods. Before I answer this question, I want to remind everybody that all of your donations, all your super chats that come in, all go to our moderators because I couldn't do this without them. I can barely walk and chew gum at the same time. If you all have seen the episodes where I didn't have a moderator and I had to answer the questions, it was painful. So please, if you can, generously remember our moderators. They deserve it. Back to the question. Yes, they are operating in a small town. And yes, they subpoenaed 900 people from the community. It is very likely that people who live in town know somebody who's on that jury. It's important to protect the identity of the jury, not just from their neighbors and peers, but from online people, from the media, from people that might hound them. It's important to protect their identity, even though you're right, the judges ask questions that probably in a small community, people are going, oh, I know who that is. So it's still important to protect them from sort of the greater population. Good question, though. And thank you, Lynn, for your donation. Sabrina Holmes. I'm curious if you think they opened the door for the financial crimes to come. I didn't think so, but I've heard varying opinions. You know, I have to be honest, I didn't get to the very end, which I understand at some point Creighton Waters did approach somebody about the money missing from Alex law firm PMPED. But I didn't get through all of it. I had to go to the dentist this morning, so that wasn't so much fun. And then I had to go get my eyelashes done because it had been 3 weeks because my lash artist was taking a vacation in Florida and tanning his buns. And so he fixed me up today. So now I have big lash energy for any of you who might have noticed. So, but I didn't get the opportunity to finish the whole hearing. I was down to about the last hour or so before we came on the air, but I will look at that. It is possible. You see, there was a dispute early before the trial started about whether or not the information about financial crimes were going to come in. The defense didn't like it coming in and said that they thought that it was character evidence. It was being brought in to prove that Alec Murdoch is a bad guy. And the prosecution said, no, we're using it to prove motive because we think it was the motive for why he killed Maggie and Paul. So there was an argument about that. And the judge said, I'm not going to pre-rule on that because the state was asking for a motion in limine, which we know is a motion limiting evidence. And the judge said, I can't give a limiting instruction because you want something to come in. It's not a limiting instruction. And the defense had not asked to limit that information from coming in. So the judge hasn't ruled yet on whether or not that information can come in. So maybe Creighton Waters has cracked the door on that information, but I think we're going to see a lot of motions outside the presence of the jury having to do with whether or not this information comes in and whether or it is character evidence that's prejudicial or whether it goes to, as Creighton Waters says, the motive. So the judge hasn't quite made a ruling on that, but I think we're going to see it maybe as early as tomorrow. Hi, Mary Howard. Isn't it possible that Taylor could have learned something from Xana's mother that could benefit Brian? Well, I think it's highly doubtful. There is a group, this is going back to the University of Idaho case. There is a group who have floated this big conspiracy theory that somehow Xana and her mother were involved in drug distribution, and that because Brian Kohberger at some point had an addiction issue, that they've jumped to the conclusion that he was there buying drugs, and that this whole thing is somehow a drug deal gone bad. There is absolutely no indication that that is the case. If at some point new information arises that shows that there was more of a connection than just happenstance, then the conflict could then arise and she could have to withdraw. But based on what we know now, I don't think that is the case. I don't think that Taylor's learned something from Xana's mother that could benefit Brian. I just don't know what that would be. Understand that Taylor was appointed. Now, she had previously represented Xana's mother, but she was appointed, and then Kara Kernodle didn't show up for court. So she was on abscond status. And I saw something posted today on Twitter that suggested that maybe she's been arrested, but I'm not sure. So I don't know at this point that her current case having to do with drug and drug possession really would have anything to do with Brian Kohberger. And I can't imagine how it would benefit him. Hi, Hazelnut. Thank you so much for your generous donation. My moderators, thank you. Question, and hi, good Lori. I'm wondering if you caught a gun discrepancy from Paul's friend, last name of Loving. He was the last witness today. And see, I didn't make it all the way through, so I haven't, I haven't heard this testimony yet. The prosecutor asked him several times if he was sure about it being the right one. So I know it's a little confusing, and I think it's going to be confusing for the jury as well. So here's the way I understand the guns. First of all, there were 25 or more guns in a gun room hanging on racks on the wall at this property. So that's a lot of firearms to go through. Some were rifles, some were pistols, some were shotguns. And so there were a lot of them. Now, what I did hear was that Roden, who is Paul's best friend and was testified earlier today, said that the two guns that were Paul's favorite were a shotgun and the 300 Blackout. What's confusing about the 300 Blackout is that there were more than one. In 2016, and this came from testimony that was offered yesterday. In 2016, Alec bought two of those 300 Blackout AR rifles, one in black and one that he had specially coated in tan. And one was for Buster and one was for Paul. So Buster had the black one, Paul had the tan one. A couple of years later, Paul's tan 300 AR disappeared out of his car. No one's really sure if it was stolen, if he left it somewhere. Paul was kind of notorious for being irresponsible with his stuff, losing stuff, leaving stuff. He was ADD, and it was just sort of one of his personality quirks. He was always losing stuff. And because he had a wealthy family, his family often replaced things he lost or were stolen. So initially, when Alec bought these guns, he bought them with thermal sights, the kind that you can see at night with, and silencers. Why you need a silencer on that kind of a gun, I don't know, but it was part of the toy. The person who actually assembled the guns, built the guns for Alec, testified. He's a second cousin of Alec's. And so he built the guns. The final bill was like $9,300 for these two AR 300 Blackouts. Later, then, the other interesting thing is that there was additional paperwork that had to be done in order to have the silencers. And Alec never got around to doing the paperwork, even though he had paid for those silencers. The thermal imaging sights alone were like $1,500 a piece, and the baffles or the silencers were also an additional cost. So later, Alec replaced the missing gun, the tan colored gun that Paul claimed had been stolen. And he bought Paul another Blackout, AR 300 Blackout. This time, though, and he bought it from the same cousin who assembled it and built it. This time, though, he said, don't put all the bells and whistles on it. I already did that. I already paid for bells and whistles. He's not getting another one with a lot of bells and whistles. So an additional $875 later, Paul got his second AR 300 Blackout. So there were three of those. One of them is unaccounted for and was the murder weapon. One of them is unaccounted for because it was lost or stolen years before. So they've been able to connect ammunition that was used, been able to connect ammunition that was fired, spent shells that were fired on the property with the missing gun, but they can't find the gun. The other thing that is missing is a shotgun that was used to murder Paul. It's unclear whether that shotgun is Paul's favorite shotgun, which Roden testified that he had him in his truck frequently. So we don't know how all the guns have been accounted for. We know that the guns that they introduced into evidence early on were not the murder weapons. And there was some dispute about whether the defense disputed whether or not they should come into evidence at all because they weren't the murder weapon. So, but there was the third 300 AR, which was Buster's black 300 AR is in evidence, as well as a couple of shotguns. So 25 or more guns on the property, hard to figure out. Paul was notorious for running around in his truck with guns. He was always had them with him when he was on the property. One of the things that they use these guns for is, now this was a 1,400 acre property, and wild pigs, wild boars are very prolific, and they're everywhere down there, and they're very destructive, they're invasive, and so there's no limit on how many you can kill. They're considered pests, and you can even hunt them at night, which was the reason for the thermal night sites. So it kind of makes sense that he'd always have one in his truck, because you never knew when you were going to come on one of these varmints. They also planted, there's been some discussion in the trial about the fact that they were planting sunflowers and other seed kinds of plants to lure the birds in, because they hunted for birds. So there's been a lot of discussion about the number of guns, where they are, all the ammunition, where it all is. And to be honest, they were not particularly great stewards of their guns. They were wealthy. It wasn't a matter of, knowing where the next gun was going to come from. They all had plenty of guns, and if they lost one, they just replaced it. Even one as expensive as an AR-300 blackout. So it is a little difficult to figure out where all those guns are, where they're going, and I'm sure that's going to be confusing for the jury. I expect that the prosecution is going to tie that up. Right now they're doing a big information dump. We're getting lots of information. How that gets tied up in sort of a roadmap for how we have to view the case is up to the prosecution, but I would expect that they're going to wrap that up fairly easily. And remember, these folks are jurors, are from this rural area, and they are familiar with the culture of hunting and owning guns. So RK wants to know, back to Brian Kohberger, if the death penalty is taken off the Moscow case, can Brian Kohberger get another attorney? The state appointed Ann Taylor because of her experience in a death case. I suppose if it is taken off the table, they would be able to appoint a different attorney for Brian Kohberger. However, Ann Taylor is the only one in that judicial district. So whether the state would be willing to appoint a different attorney for him based on a non-conflict or not, I don't know. I think that would be up to Ann Taylor. If she went to the state and said, look, even though there's not really a conflict, there's an appearance of a conflict and I want off, then they might be more inclined. But unless she asks, I don't see them taking her off the case. Hello, compassionate RN. I thought all RNs were compassionate. Everyone I've ever met is a compassionate soul. Do you think Rogan's statement about there being no reason for Alex to kill Maggie and Paul will hurt the prosecution's case? Not necessarily, because I think he's coming at it from his perspective of being like his second family. him knowing these people in that way, okay, knowing them in that context. And in the context he knows them in, he probably didn't see any reason why Alex would kill Maggie and Paul. It kind of is character evidence, but sort of, kind of, not really. I think that the jurors will be instructed, as every juror is, that it's up to them to decide what weight they give to any particular piece of information or evidence. So does that weigh more than other evidence? I don't know. I think that it would be easy to look at it and say, he's a young guy, probably not privy to a lot of personal things going on, perhaps between Maggie and Alex, between Maggie and Paul, between Alex and his law partners, his financial situation. I mean, this is a young guy who hung out with the kids, and say what you might about the Murdaughs, they don't strike me as the kind of folks who were sort of airing their personal stuff to their kids. They seem to be the kind of parents who, kind of old-fashioned and said, our stuff is our stuff, and you just have to go be a kid. And so I think it's very possible that Rogan could say, I never saw any problems. I don't see any reason why Alex would kill Maggie and Paul. But that doesn't mean that the reason doesn't exist. It just means that he was a young person, was kind of sheltered with the rest of the kids, and probably wasn't privy to those sorts of discussions or that sort of information. So I don't necessarily think it's going to hurt their case that much. I think it'd be easy to say, well, of course he couldn't see that. He didn't work at Alex's law firm. He didn't live in his bedroom. He didn't, he was not privy to a lot of the information that other people might know. Good questions tonight, folks. I really appreciate all of your questions. We're right at the 1 hour mark. So I would just encourage everybody, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. We are coming up on the Vallow Daybell case in early April, and I'm going to be there in person. I moved to Boyce, Idaho in order to be closer to the trial, and I'm going to be there every day, except for a few days right around my daughter's wedding. And so I really encourage you to subscribe, because when I'm there, I definitely will be coming as if you've seen Gigi, you see her do, getting on to make quick recordings during the breaks and after court. So if you aren't a subscriber and you don't get notifications, you're not going to get notified when those come up. So please think about subscribing if you haven't. Hit the like button, because it does help with our algorithm. You'd be amazed at how it moves us up in the popularity chain for YouTube, and we appreciate that. We appreciate it because it generates more income for our mods. So please like and subscribe. I want to thank all of you who have donated tonight so generously and in the past. I appreciate that those of us who can do. We would never ask you to donate if you're not able, but we appreciate it because it all goes directly to our great moderators, Michelle and Brenda. So please join us on Friday. On Friday, we're going to talk about all things Daybell. There's some new filings that came out today So we're going to see more and more of these new filings as we get closer to trial date. So please join us on Friday, same time, and as we talk about all things Daybell. I'm going to stay on the Murdoch case, and we'll have the opportunity to talk about that one and the Koberger case as well. So until then, have a great week, enjoy, and we'll see you on Friday. Have a great night.